Okay, so we are really excited today to have Neena join us and share on this topic. Just a little bit of an aside. Um, Welcome to the Lunch and Learn. We do these about once a month or so, and we were thrilled that Neena was interested in doing this. So I'm going to read a little bit about her. For those who don't know, um, Neena is a graduate of the EDD and was the 2023 recipient of the Creighton CPCE Alumni Merit Award, and well earned for sure. Uh, Dr. Nizar serves as the founder and executive director of the Janssens Foundation, a nonprofit established in 2017 to develop treatments for Janssen's metaphysical. I'm sorry, I should know how to pronounce that. I don't. I'm sure we'll hear soon. An ultra rare bone disease that affects less than 30 people worldwide. Dr. Nizar has a doctoral degree in educational leadership from Creighton University, is a TEDx speaker, a blogger, a disability and inclusion advocate, and Nebraska's Mother of the Year for 2018. Nizar is also a rare disease patient herself and mother to two boys with Janssen's disease. She is the director of patient advocacy strategy at the Center for Rare Disease and ICON PLC, a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization, and supports rare disease-focused biotech and pharmaceutical companies to develop and implement a strong patient advocacy strategy and to incorporate the patient voice into the clinical development lifecycle. Dr. Nizar also serves higher education by teaching English and leadership studies. Her topic today is turning the Jesuit charisms into action, changing the rare disease drug development landscape. And we're excited to have her with us. Really briefly, if you can mute, that would be great during the presentation. But if you do have a question, Dr. Nizar has graciously offered to answer that during the flow of her presentation itself. So feel free to raise your hands, so to speak, on Zoom, and we'd be happy to unmute and have you participate. Otherwise, you can put questions in the chat and we'll save those to the end. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nizar.
Thanks so much, Dr. Martin. Really happy and excited to be here, and share my sort of journey with everyone, because it's been such an amazing journey full of ups and downs. And I really wanted to, when Dr. Martin asked if I would do a session, I jumped at it because I really believe that this is a wonderful program, and I'm so glad that I have this ability to do this. So my topic today is turning the Jesuit charisms into action. And I want to start by sort of sharing a little bit about my story, because it all starts with my story in that, so I was born in Dubai, and in the Middle East, at a time when, there was absolutely no Google. Um, and there was nothing really available in terms of expert opinions apart from what you got when you went to see the doctor. So it's not really the Dubai that you see when you when you look for images of Dubai today on the internet. This was Dubai in the 1980s, and it was like covered with sand, miles and miles of sand. And when I was born, I actually, had misdiagnosis, and in the sense that no one could understand what exactly was going on with me. Um, my parents told the doctors that, my daughter's bones are bending, and they wouldn't believe him. And he was an engineer. And so my earliest memories of my childhood were those of being tied to an ironing board. Now you can imagine that. Just, I was probably 4 or 5, and he'd lie me out on the line on an ironing board, and tie me up to keep my bones from straight, so that they wouldn't bend. And because he was thinking of a problem to solve. And at that time, we had gone to so many doctors, and they gave me a ton of misdiagnoses in terms of rickets and all sorts of things. And finally, I just, they said, take your daughter home and, just pray. And so my parents did take me home, and they didn't only pray, but they raised me with the mission that I would see my disability or my disease as really something to solve for, rather than a deterrent to any future I may have. Remember, this was 1980s. We didn't have a name for a diagnosis. Then we had no idea what the future would hold. So and I'd like to mention that at 16, which is really important because at 16, I had a full ride scholarship to go study at Creighton University, journalism. And I was so excited when that letter came. But my parents had no idea where Nebraska was on the world map. And they were so worried to send their daughter with this unknown diagnosis and rare disease out into the world, so to speak. And by then I had gone through over 3 to 4 dozen surgeries. I've spent a lot of my time in hospital growing up, so it was extremely challenging for my parents to even begin to fathom the idea of me going anywhere outside their home. But and so as you can imagine, I was crushed, about this predicament and the situation. I mean, who has, and I really wondered, what that future would be. A few years later, I continued my education. I went on to I went on to get a degree in English. And so I took an honors in English, and then I took a master's in English, and I took a master's in philosophy. And, I was at that time of life when I was really serving the community. Now, remember, all this time, I had no idea about the Jesuit charisms. I had no idea about the Jesuit values. I had grown up in an Islamic country. I was Muslim, and I went to a Catholic school, and I attended, the school grounds had a temple, a Hindu temple just opposite the school, and it had a Catholic church within the school grounds. But I went to Islamic classes. So while I had friends from all over the world, I had never come across the Jesuit charisms, and I never knew anything about the Jesuit way of life at all. And I had no idea. Even though I had applied to college when I was 16, I didn't really look too much into the religious aspect or the Jesuit values of the college. I was just excited as a 16-year-old to get a full ride scholarship to study a subject that I was so passionate about. So when so as I was beginning to do the work in the community, because Dubai at that time, and it really still is, a very inaccessible world. And so I grew up in a school where there was no elevator to get to your class. And since I had several surgeries, my father carried me up 2 flights of stairs every single day to get to school, to get to class. And as I grew up, I realized how inaccessible my world was, and I had become very very vocal about all of the barriers that I had begun to face. But again, and I began writing about it. So that's why I had this urge to study journalism, because it allowed me that freedom of expression to raise issues within the community. And so once I realized that, as an adult, as I realized, I really wanted to break away from my parents to see if I could live my life on my own, with this medical condition that really required quite a bit of intervention. And so my parents had gone back to India, and I remained in Dubai, and I, continued education, and I pursued teaching, and I was happy teaching and serving my community. And really, lo and behold, I met my husband. Um, and it turned out that he was from Nebraska. And so, what a coincidence, how the world works, and how God really puts things in place that you have no idea is going to happen. So we were married, and 2 years later, the doctors had said to us that, you'd never have children. And we had accepted it, and we were okay with it because, we didn't really think that I would be able to have children. And when we had gone to doctors, they had been very, very adamant that no, you're not going to have a child. And so we were in the process of adopting a child when I did get pregnant. And all through my pregnancy, doctors told us, you have to get rid of the baby because this is going to cause tremendous trouble for you, your health. But really, all through my 9 months of pregnancy, I had absolutely no issues. I mean, I was healthy. There was no signs of any problems. Every single visit was absolutely fine. And the baby grew as well and was very healthy. And so and that was my first lesson, never to trust medical professionals in that they don't always have to be right. So in the Christmas of 2009, I had this beautiful baby boy, and we named him Arshan because and that was Persian for a good man. And he really came to us with absolutely no sign of disease. He was nothing like me. There was nothing wrong with him at all. And we enjoyed for 2 years with Arshan. He was the biggest baby born in the ward that year. He was 9 pounds. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm really not more than 4 feet. And so for me to deliver such a huge baby was such a big spectacle in the hospital at the time. But Arshan developed like any other child would. He met all his milestones, and absolutely everything was fine. And 2 years later, we had another baby boy. And this time things were really different. And so at that point in time, we understood that there was something amiss about this pregnancy and this baby because things were not feeling right. Not that the doctor said something was wrong, but I just had this sense that my life was going to drastically change. And it was just this sense, this overwhelming feeling that something about the whole trajectory of my life was going to change. And when Jahan was born, he was healthy, but there was definitely something off about him. And again, doctors couldn't place it. And it was at this time that my older son started to regress. He just totally went downhill. He started developing lots of pains in his legs. And we started getting blood results for both boys that seemed extremely um, um, off. They had talked about higher levels of calcium and all sorts of things. And then they both were detected with having kidney issues. So they actually had kidney, it's called the first stage of kidney failure. And so, and I had lived so long with absolutely none of these issues. And this really confused me. It confused my husband. I went back to all the medical records I had of my own birth, and I couldn't find any trace of anything similar in our stories. And so I began this journey. I quit my job, and I spent the next few months, I think it was 6 to 7 months, searching for a diagnosis, figuring out, like, I was determined to figure out what's going on here with my boys. And I hoped that there were tools available that would help me. But I ran up against a wall of just, again, nobody in the world could tell me what was wrong with my children or what was wrong with me. And I had sent numerous emails all across the world to figure out and x-rays of my children, and no one could tell me what was wrong. So I had begun to give up hope, and I prayed that somehow we would have answers. And one night, my father, again, he's really my superhero in all of this. He came to me with an article and said, there's a doctor in South India that is a geneticist and we should go see her. And I was really skeptical because by then we had seen so many people. But he convinced me to make one final trip to see this doctor. And so it was Dr. Sheila Nambudri, and she was out at Amrita Research Institute in South India. And we drove 7 hours to go see her after I traveled back to India. And then I waited in her waiting room for 5 hours. And all that time I was thinking, why am I here? I mean, this is so ridiculous. I was tired, it was hot, and there was no air condition, and I had my son, and he was very young at the time, and they were all very restless, and there was this sense of something was going to be different. But yet I was so overwhelmed by the environmental factors of the situation. And my father said, just keep patient and keep praying. And so I did, and it calmed me. And so I entered them to see the, and I'd taken a lot of tests. And so the x-rays were up on the screen, and she looked at them and she said, a whole minute to digest what she said. It was as if, it was a surreal experience. And pretty soon I realized that she had been to Germany as a researcher, and she was taught in a class for skeletal dysplasias. And the the professor had shown the class one slide of a Jansen's patient and said to the class, I'm going to skip this slide because you're never going to see a patient. And the minute she saw my x-rays, she connected it, and she called her professor and said, I don't have one, I have 3 patients with Jansen's. And so began our journey in the world of rare disease. And at the time, we learned that Jansen's metaphyseal chondrodysplasia is one of the rarest diseases in the world. There are only 30 patients known to date. And it's an autosomal dominant condition. It's caused by an activating mutation in the PTH and PTHRP receptor. And I was the only patient out of all the history of patients that had a mosaic gene, which meant that that's why I never got diagnosed for 32 years. That's why no one could diagnose me, because I had this anomaly within this ultra rare condition. And so, I sat with that information and I wondered, it's almost like your crossroads of your life, wondering, what can you do? And one of the things that really struck me was that when I Googled the disease at that time, I realized there was no information. There was no information when I was a child, and there was no information now that I had children of my own. And something in me really changed. I said to myself, I'm going to change this narrative. I'm never going to allow another mother to come across this disease and Google it and find nothing. So there was one lone paper, and which was a list of other skeletal diseases, but it had one line in there, and it said that we could turn off the overactive PTH receptor through a ligand. And this was written by Dr. Harold Jupiner. So I mailed him and I said, you know, I have Jansen's, and I'd love to. And I found this paper which you wrote, and I'm really excited about this one line. And he said to me, "Oh, it's wonderful to meet you, but we don't have any ligands developed for Jansen's." And so I asked him, what would it take to develop that ligand? And he said, well, it'll take a lot of money. And so I, even before I sent that email and he responded, I knew where I needed to be. So my husband and I packed our bags almost silently without even exchanging a word. We packed our bags and we came to find Dr. Jupner. And this is me meeting him at the NIH. The board is very historically relevant because I had no idea how to put up a science board at a big conference at the National Institute of Health. But I knew in the plane that I had enough information because I had been reading and I had been learning, and I had my own personal story. And I knew of x-rays and I knew what it looked like. So I put this board together. It was the only board that looked like this, as you can imagine, but it was the only board that got a lot of attention as well. And we met Dr. Jupner, and he had been studying Jansen's disease for 20 years and never met a patient. And he met me for the first time, and 2 years later, he met my boys. And we began this we began this story to change the trajectory of this disease. So the Janssen Foundation was formed in February of 2017. And we decided, and it was really formed by just a few of us, myself, a doctor in Omaha, and my son's physical therapist. And so we started this because we found patients across the world with this condition, and we knew that it was impacting lives beyond just us. And so the foundation was formed, and the same year, with the support of the Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital, we published the first paper on Jansen's metaphysical chondrodysplasia with Dr. Sheila Nambudri, and all of the findings that she had after diagnosing us. And later, I started blogging and started writing about, in several journals and several spaces, about the childhood of those living with Jansen's disease. This is a picture of my son on the left and how his legs were when we first arrived, and the kind of surgery that was required to straighten his legs. But it never really does stay straight because as the bones grow, they continuously bend, and therefore you have to have continuous surgery. And when the doctors said to me that this is the treatment we have, and I remembered my own days with these horrid rings, I just kept thinking to myself, there's got to be another way. And so we began thinking and planning about how do we bring this inverse agonist to trial. And part of that journey was to create awareness around a little or absolutely unknown disease, and a rare disease, or as they call it, an orphan disease. And so we soon caught the attention of TLC. There's a story on Discovery Channel about us. And I began to blog and start speaking in different spaces about Jansen's disease. And I quickly learned that there are 400 skeletal dysplasias in the world today, and none of them have a treatment. And so began my experience with rare bone diseases and minority diseases that really don't get the light of day because they just aren't prevalent enough. And then in the process, our foundation and the work I did online, socially, and just speaking at different venues across the world began to garner attention, but also people began to Google Jansen's and find us. And therefore, we began to find patients across the globe. Right now, we have 11 living patients because this is a progressive and debilitating condition. And many of these 11 are children. I am one of the only adults still living today with this condition. And so I began going and presenting at different conferences. In 2017, I was in Colorado, and this is the biggest bone conference there is. And these are some of the, so to say, big wigs in skeletal disease areas. And these teams started to look at bone conditions like Jansen's. And I gave my genes and my blood and my cells to start developing mice models at the lab in Harvard Medical School. And along with that, we started beginning to develop the first inverse agonist to improve the bone parameters of Jansen's. And, oops. Sorry, it's something funny with the computer. But what we started to see is that we had a proof of concept. We were able to see that the mice models were responding to the inverse agonist. And in 2017, I helped write a grant with the NIH, with Harvard Medical School, to be able to get the first R01 grant for preclinical studies, and then submitted a pre-IND. These are all different steps of the drug development process that we created a new path for. So usually it can take up to 20 years and over close to $13 to $20 million to develop a treatment. And when I saw that pathway, I said, no, I'm going to make my own. And so instead of partnering with any pharmaceutical company, I decided to work with the government to find a treatment for this disease. Well, one of the earliest comments that I received with care space that actually told me nobody's going to care about 30 patients in the world. Word for word, that's what was said to me. And I remember thinking, he's talking about me, and he's talking about my kids. So that really struck me as the value that we give to human life, and the value that we give to the dignity that we offer people who are suffering amongst us, and the fact that treatment is really connected to an economic return. And so I started working with the NIH to begin to figure out what are other pathways we can have in place for people with rare disease. And so, as you can see, this path has been, in many ways, moved forward because of the work that I've done in the space to get us to a first in human trial, which is really a big deal. It sometimes takes 20 years, but we've been able to really fast forward and get it to first in human trial this year, where my boys will receive treatment, and so will some of the others. And so I began to see how my voice was not only able to help my kids and the people in our foundation with Jansen's, but it also became a voice for everyone with an ultra rare disease and with rare diseases in general. I began to really advocate for change within the healthcare system to recognize rare disease. I gave several talks. I talked to our legislation and in Nebraska, and then at the federal level, I have lobbied with Congress to support different policies that will accelerate treatments. But there's a lot of work left to be done. And here's where some of these Jesuit charisms came into play for me. And I want to highlight some of them. The idea that there is an unmet need around us, and sometimes you stumble upon it and it really stares you in the face, and you have an opportunity to begin to do something that will change the narrative for someone else. And so I was really, time and again, just my whole life story has been pivotal moments in time where, when I attended the first EDD seminar, I began to realize all of the values that this education has given me that really resonates with me in the work I do, even without recognizing, oh, this is this charism, that I have begun to do the work that needs to be done in the space because I'm able to understand really how lonely it can be not to have treatments and have people tell you that your life does not matter. So rare disease really represents a significant unmet medical need. We have over 7,000. And now this year, the number has increased to 10,000 rare diseases. And approximately 30% of these are children who will not live to see their fifth birthday. And only 5% of these rare diseases have an approved FDA treatment. And 50% of all rare diseases are children. So this is really a national crisis, but in the midst of the fact that because these diseases are so different, we can't, they don't join together, and therefore they're not visible. And that has been the greatest challenge in this space. And I really wanted to address, because I'm not sure what everyone's background is. However, I did want to take the opportunity to show you what are some of the challenges that we have in this rare space and how it can be addressed, or some of the work that we still needs to be done. So the biggest one is diagnosis. And a patient with a rare disease, maximum will see an average of 7.3 physicians before getting to a diagnosis. And sometimes it can take anything between 4 to 8 years to get an accurate diagnosis. And we still have a whole range, a subset of patients who have no diagnosis at all and are actually fall into the category of undiagnosed. And there are many reasons for this. One is poor access to diagnostic tools. Remember, when I was in Dubai, I had no form of whole genome sequencing or any of the tools that are now available in America, but still, if you don't have insurance coverage, you won't be able to pay for it. And many times, a diagnosis can go untreated because the doctor that you're seeing doesn't have the knowledge to think of looking for a rare disease. So there is a saying in the rare disease space: if you hear, if you hear hooves or footsteps of you have to think of a zebra and not just a horse. So not many people think of the zebra when they look at a patient in front of them. The next challenge really is the cost of drug development. This healthcare has always been about economics and how much money is made in profits from the developing of new treatments. And so it can cost anything between $13 to $20 million to make one new treatment. And it can take 20 years to bring that treatment to the market. And if you don't have a complete understanding of endpoints, that is, what are some of the things you want to see within a disease that you want to target, then it makes it really harder to develop a treatment. You need an intervention, but if you don't understand disease progression, then it's really hard to do a sort of precision medicine like that. And most rare diseases are difficult to understand because, one, nobody studies them. We were really fortunate and blessed to be able to see Dr. Jufner and his team take on Jansen's and study it, but not many in the healthcare space even look at rare disease. It's not even in textbooks. It's not on any of the material that we're asked to study in class. And so this inequity of the healthcare system, which is the next point and the next challenge that we see. Access to services and therapies. If you are in countries that don't have these supports, we now support many children across the globe. And sometimes I have spent hours trying to find out what kind of support services that we can get to these patients who live in Brazil or who live in Paraguay or Australia, even in remote parts of Australia. How do we get access to to tools and medical equipment. Sometimes it's so expensive, and that we'll have to fundraise for that. Even if it exists, it becomes an enormous problem to even access. And then the costs of managing patients with this rare disease, the price of medicine, all of these are barriers to the healthcare system. And then data. I'd like to touch upon data because, somebody said that data will be the most valuable commodity of the 21st century. And it is so true, even in the rare disease space. Data is something that's so valuable. Patients have data, but it's so difficult for patients to own that data. So you have to, in order to get a treatment, you are forced to give your data to understand your disease to others who may not always have your best interest. And therefore, information gathering, sharing becomes so complicated. And therefore, there are privacy issues and there's issues of ownership of data. In the rare disease space now, we are seeing patients become more savvy to setting up, establishing startups of their own, getting into data platforms, because data is so important. Unless pharmaceutical companies and unless the spaces have the drug developers have data, you cannot develop a treatment. And so therein lies again the power struggle between those who are in a position of authority and those of us like patients who are on the receiving end and who are so vulnerable in those positions to be really taken advantage of. And as much as we like to think that we want to push for a partnership, you really have to advocate for that partnership. And it's oftentimes very, very disheartening. Patient burden is the next challenge. Many of us in this space who do this work are also burdened by the fact that, the impacts of rare disease on a family, on a marriage, on children, the trauma that the children go through every day, the medical anxiety that comes from numerous interventions and hospital stays can cause a lot of stress on the family. Very recently, there was a study that showed that the financial burden on a family who does not have a diagnosis costs about $250,000 a year to our system, to our national healthcare system. So all of this, and I'm going to pause here if anybody has any questions before I know it's almost 12:40.
Hi, Neena. Sherry.
Yes.
Just to say to you, I appreciate everything that you're doing for your rare disease. Those of us with orphan diseases, it takes forever. I've been living with mine for almost 60 years, and slowly other people around the world. I would say that technology has been our best supporting tool because it connects all of us and we're able to find each other. So what you're doing and how people are finding you and finding the foundation is huge.
Thank you so much. So these are some of the challenges, and I'm not sure if anyone on here has a healthcare background or has ideas or has thoughts about how it affects your life or the work you do. Anyone? I know it's a very niche topic.
Hi, Neena. It's Chris.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually see quite a bit of this come through. I actually strangely and coincidentally enough also work for Icon.
Really?
Yeah, I work in the Accellacare site network side.
Oh, wonderful.
So I see the clinical research that comes through on these things. And I mean, you're not to just sit here and confirm, but your take on the situation of how these things get developed and how these orphan diseases and rare diseases get um you know addressed and treated, it's everything from, to add an extra layer on that, right? Everything as it's going through all this drug development, even coming into the site side of it, the identification of an investigator to even be able to do the research, and the way that the research is set around and scoped around, it's especially one as rare as, as what you have. It's the barriers are astronomical in it, and so being able to even just find those researchers that can do it, it's definitely a blessing in that side, that you were able to find someone who'd spent quite a bit of time working on that as well too, I think. So um I've in a much lesser way dealt with my own medical issues and sides of things, and I know that that's something that never leaves you. And so um it's very interesting that and really amazing, into a testament of how someone can take this and understand it and make a difference. But I think the overall lesson here is that if you want to make a change or see the change, you can't just crawl in the hole and try to escape it. Or there are so many things you could have done too, where it's like, look, I'm just going to work with my kids and this, and you definitely had that mother's drive to say, no, we're going to change the entire scenario. We're going to take this script and we're going to rewrite it, and we're going to make a difference. So yeah, I see this every day too. And definitely fascinating that your take on it, and how you've kind of roped it in with the charisms. I have to applaud that. So
That's wonderful, Chris. What are the chances that you're from Icon Care as well? Like,
yeah, right. Actually, I said, well, and so actually, I'll tell you this. I always look into these when they get sent out. And when Dr. Martin sent it out, I looked at it. Well, I'm no chance missing this, because this aligns perfectly, and as it does in this world of interdisciplinary work. So but yeah, I know, very odd chances that it all kind of came back around. So
that's awesome. And I love the work you're doing in Care. I always make sure that we include that. So for those of you who don't know, Chris and Care does a lot of patient support tools to make sure that patients are able to access sites easily. And that's what's needed. So I'm really proud to be a part of Icon, because we are trying to put patients first.
Looks like there was a question from Tom, um, and he asks, are there similarities with Jansen's and Fragile X syndrome? By similarities, I mean the path you have been on to get a diagnosis, treatment, and research.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yes, there are similarities in that it's another ultra rare disease, but I have seen more interest in Fragile X than there has been in rare bone conditions like Jansen's, because it really depends on how many patients it impacts, and therefore how much investment goes into it. But yes, if you're looking at a treatment pathway, I would say that, for rare diseases, the typical drug development pathway doesn't really work, because it could take you years and years and just so much money that it falls on foundations to be able to raise on their own. And that can be extremely burdensome to a family. And that's one of the reasons why I sort of made sure that we took a different path. Like, we had to really create our own path with the NIH and with NCATS. NCATS is the translational side of drug development at the NIH. And if that's something you're looking at, I would highly recommend looking into some of the grants that they have out there. They look for ultra rare diseases and rare diseases that don't have much of a pathway, and they work with early clinical research to get you ready for trials.
I'd like to ask a question. Speaking, I mean, you sharing your story of how, isolating it was for you as a victim of this disease, and then with your boys. How has that community of parents and folks that have this disease, how has that developed? And I would imagine that's just got to be a tremendous relief to it on that perspective, just to have others who understand what you're going through.
Yes, I think that when you think about your service to others, the charism of for people for others, and you think about the fact that you live in this space and you understand what isolation can be when you have a rare disease, and the problems and challenges that my kids face every day, we are able to now put structures in place, whether that be a counselor, or whether that be a focus group that we have every other week of our patients coming together and just kind of talking together. We had our first international summit here in Omaha, and we do a walk every year where we bring down all these patients from the world so we can be together and just speak about some of our frustrations and challenging days. But it is the power of community is so strong. The ability to be able to get together is just sort of really life-changing in that way. I mean, it really just, I grew up not knowing anybody with this disease and never really knowing what that future looks like. But I have to say, sometimes it's really sad too, Jim, because you don't want to know that people are dying with this disease. Right? So when you meet each other, you just don't want your kids to hear that. You don't want them to see progression in that way. So it really is a delicate balance about keeping that positivity, as well as making sure that we get resources in a timely manner to the different patients, and really living in that moment and embracing what we have, as well as understanding the work that needs to be done in this space to change that.
Thank you.
I have one very short question, but when you were talking, I mean, it really story drew me in, and I was actually thinking, like about when you talk about the whole research and everything being, so in silos, and one of the things that I years ago, drew me to interdisciplinary thinking and interdisciplinary approaches, even transdisciplinary, even my dissertation and everything. I really got into these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches and thinking, because I mean, it is so easy to isolate the different dimensions or focus on one dimension, like for example, like medical dimension. But I mean, I cannot imagine, the whole emotional dimension, social dimension, of one medical issue. All of those different, disciplines or perspectives of or situations coming together, and and so because focusing on one dimension, they leave out many other dimensions that also play a critical role in an experience like this. And for me, my question is a little bit about allyship, to be allies, allies in this case with the Jensen disease community. How can we be, like people from different backgrounds and different disciplines, and how can we be an ally, to you and to the Jensen disease community?
I think that's a really great question, because you know, one of the thoughts I had while I was in the EDD program was how much the intersection there is with healthcare, with physical therapy and PTs and OTs, and the business side of the house and the economics of it all, and the law. Like, we have minority groups that don't understand even their rights as a patient. So there are so many gaps within the system that an interdisciplinary program can address. It's because we don't. It's because we don't give opportunity to highlight that we don't really know how to approach it. But I just came back from San Diego, and I was at an equity summit, and I was talking about the inequities of rare disease, and how the disparities of treatment exist. So even within the rare disease space, people of color or people with disability or people who are disenfranchised, so you are disenfranchised within a minority group. So the work we do at Creighton, the work that we do in the spaces, really needs to be including rare disease, because it gives everyone the opportunity to reach out to more minority groups who would probably not even know a pathway to treatment, or like Chris was saying, having researchers, so having even the medical community steeped in the knowledge as they come into the community is going to be empowering, because the next time they see a patient who has a rare disease, they'll be able to connect them to resources. One of the biggest drawbacks of having a rare disease is coming into an office and having a doctor tell you there's no hope, right? I mean, that statement is just the worst. And you never want to hear that. You want to hear what are some of the resources, and these can be community resources. These can be resources that I can go to just get support, not necessarily a new treatment. Andrew, I think you have your hand up.
Oh, I just had a question when you were done with Dr. Gutierrez's question. So
No, go ahead.
So I wanted to say, one, thank you for all the work you've done with this. I have not obviously something as rare as Jansen's, but I'm rare for the disease I have. I have Parkinson's. And
Yes.
I remember when I got diagnosed, I kept going to different specialists and doctors, and they would all start off the conversation with, well, you're a little young for this, aren't you? And I'm like, I didn't diagnose myself, brother. Like,
Yeah.
because somebody sent me to you. And that feeling of feeling like an equation that a doctor was trying to solve rather than like the full holistic. And I guess that's kind of go to your presentation about the charisms in action, seeing me as a whole person, being able to think. And then of course I'm living in the weeds right now. It's my first semester in the cohort. We're doing our interdisciplinary memoirs. So of course I'm having to relive all of these experiences, with this kind of challenges and stuff, and that being the precipice. And I kept thinking about the whole trying to turn it into something positive that you've tried to do, and how tiring that is sometimes. I felt like there was such a times where it's like, if I wasn't having a good day, people didn't want to be around me. They didn't know what to do with me. They just didn't know what to do. It's like I either had to be on top of my game and the most best version of myself every day while going through initial treatment, or I was, the sick pity case. There was no middle ground. And I guess, thinking about your and you kind of echo Dr. Gutierrez's questions about the interdisciplinary nature, how are these experiences as someone who lives it, but also administers and works in these fields and tries to bring this together? I mean, there's so much you can do through personality and force of will, but how much of this has been amplified by just, you have the family connection, but you also have a larger connection, and this experience that you got through Creighton. So thank you again for your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, first off, thank you for sharing about your Parkinson's. Having any kind of diagnosis is hard, whether it's ultra rare or having Parkinson's. So I absolutely feel what you're going through. But I do want to bring it back to the leadership, right? That we talk about in our classrooms all the time in the EDD program, and what that really amounts to sometimes in your life journey. I was just sharing before we started this conversation with Dr. Martin that, when I entered the EDD program, my children, we had just moved from Dubai to America in 2015, and I joined the EDD program in 2016, and my kids were in hospital for 7 months. And I had written to my parents and said, I have to go for the seminar. And I was in Delaware at the time with them and in hospital, and I have to go for the seminar. And remember, at 16, I had already been denied the chance to have a Creighton education by situations. And so my parents decided, well, this time it's not going to be the same story. And they flew down from India to be in the hospital with my kids as I flew to Omaha to attend the seminar and the classes. And so, part of me reflects now upon those situations, because they were some of the really grimmest and toughest times I've been through, Andrew, because you at one end you really want to do this course, and the second end you really want to be with your kids. And at times when that happens, I really stress, and I go back to some of the learnings that I had in my EDD and in my classes. And, sometimes you are in those classes and you think that these have no connection to what you do, right? And now as I reflect upon it, it really makes so much sense to me, because it gave me a lot of comfort to know that there is something bigger than myself. Right. And there is a sort of bigger narrative than the work we do every day. Some of us choose professions because yes, it pays the bills, but I gave up higher ed to move into, because I was teaching at Metro Community College here, and I gave that up to really move into icon, because I knew what I had done for my disease I could do for other diseases. And I saw a gap. I saw the gap between what sponsors and pharmaceutical companies were missing when they begin this drug development journey. And I knew that if I was in the room, I would be able to make at least the right input at the right time to completely change that, maybe a couple of years short off of the drug development process. So it is, but all of this is extremely hard, Andrew. It takes a toll on you mentally. I have no social life apart from my work. I don't do other things. The other day I got a text from this moms group, which I should say nobody should ever enroll in a moms group if you have a life other than a regular, because they said that they want to go have wine and cheese, and I just thought to myself, I don't even have the capacity to think about that, right? To go and just enjoy a moment of time of just sitting there, because I just can't. And it doesn't phase me anymore as much as it probably would, Andrew, but I've always grown up having these kind of challenges. It's become a part of whom I am, and I've always had to problem solve. And I think that as a leader of the community, not just Jansen's, but, I now really help a lot. There are 400 skeletal diseases, and I speak to all of them, and I help with all of their development. And now at ICON, I help a broader rare disease, portfolio. So I'm always thinking, and it's just a mindset, really. You've sort of be, you've sort of framed your life in that way, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
As somebody watching this, I'm wondering, for those in attendance and those that may watch this later, how can we contribute to the work of the Jansen's Foundation? How can just individuals who are moved by what you've shared, bring something to that?
I think, Dr. Martin, I think the biggest thing we need in rare disease is the ability of great minds to come together and address gaps. Like, if we were to have, say, for instance, the chance to be able to have a platform to say, here are the gaps, how can we as a collective contribute to adjusting? So who's responsible for this gap? What can a solution be? And then really begin to rally around that in terms of allyship. Even having a platform to discuss these issues that affect different minority groups, and give strategies to not just patients, but all those in the space. I mean, it's a beautiful life goal and sort of an ideal that I'd like to get to, because the earlier we're able to get to the grassroots, that's where the change is going to happen. It's not pharmaceutical companies, or it's not biotech that's going to make that difference. I think it's much earlier on. It's working with communities and building and empowering communities that are disenfranchised within the healthcare system. And that requires an interdisciplinary approach.
I was just thinking of an analogy. Some recently came to my mind, an interesting analogy that when we go to different universities and we see the rare books section, the rare books. Wow! I mean, this is a huge building, a lot of money, put into these rare books, and a lot of attention and all of that. So, How can we do that for this kind of a rare, rare disease, and to really part of our how can we do to part of our mission is to make this rare, like Jensen, as a rare disease, to be visible.
Correct, to give visibility. Yes.
Throughout the world, in our communities, and everything, even though it's rare, but it deserves great attention as well.
Yeah, so any wing of the college and the university that touches upon rare disease should have an education around it. So
Yeah.
that's how we would be able to empower very early on. And I've always said this, education is key, education and awareness. Had that doctor not seen the slide of a Jensen's patient, we would still be without a diagnosis, right? So how many countless patients who are underdiagnosed right now need that one champion, right? So how can we as an educational institute and an interdisciplinary course begin to bridge that gap? That's where we have to put our resources. And I've said this so many times, like it's education, educating doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals. Like Chris said, we can't find researchers. We can't find people who are willing to fight this battle with us. So how do we empower them to do it?
Well, are there any last questions? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nizar. I think we've all learned a lot during this conversation, and I applaud you for your efforts, and hope that everyone else can turn on your cameras, and let's give Dr. Nizar a round of applause.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I know
Thank
it's a
you very
really
much.
niche topic, but if you think about it, it really affects everyone at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we can all think of folks that we know that while they may not suffer from this particular disease, have other conditions that are similarly ignored by a healthcare system.
Yes.
They're not money makers.
Yes. Thank
But
you.
real quick,
Thank you.
do you work with a biologist at all? Not just a
Yes.
geneticist? Okay, because I actually have a Nobel Prize winner in my pocket
Wonderful.
from UMass, so I wanted to send that to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for arranging this.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure. And thank you for being part of it. Thanks everybody for attending today. We do these again about once a month, and hopefully perhaps we'll be able to have Dr. Nizar back at some point in the future. Clearly, this has been an interesting, sobering discussion, and one that is of great importance and very applicable to our interdisciplinary work. So also, Andrew, I love the Department of Political Science shirt.
Yeah.
We gotta do that.
I got to be totally honest. I completely didn't forget, but it's Casual Friday right now at Ohio State, and so I felt the need to represent my department. So
Yep.
works out well.
Yeah. Yep. Gotta represent the political scientists.
And we will see
Awesome.
you, Andrew. We will see you next week or in a few days over here in campus. Exciting.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I've been just chatting with some folks about this too. So yeah, we're very excited. I have been saying though, I'm going to be interested to see how much smaller Creighton is than Ohio State. So
A lot smaller.
Just a bit.
just a little bit. So
Nice
yeah.
All right. Well,
All right,
thank you so
thanks,
much.
everybody.
Have a
Thank you,
nice
everybody.
weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
Dr. Nizar. Bye, Jim.